Adissa was known throughout her village not for the things children usually become known for, like laughter or playfulness, but for a silence that seemed to settle around her like a shadow. From the moment she was born, she hardly cried, hardly spoke, and never once let her tears fall freely. Her eyes were steady and calm like polished stones, reflecting the world without betraying a hint of what stirred inside. Villagers often whispered about her in hushed tones, calling her the girl of stone eyes. Some said she was blessed, others feared she was cursed. But Adissa herself felt only a quiet heaviness she could not explain. In her village, where the sun drenched the earth in golden warmth and the ancient baobab trees stood as silent sentinels, traditions were sacred and unyielding. Among these customs, there was none more important than the rite of mourning. When a loved one died, especially a father or mother, the daughters were expected to cry openly and loudly at the gravesite. Their tears were believed to guide the spirit of the departed into the next world, a bridge between the living and the ancestors. To cry was not merely an act of sorrow, it was a sacred duty, a ritual that preserved the balance of the village's spiritual harmony. Adissa understood this better than anyone. Yet, from the moment her father's body was laid out beneath the great fig tree, she felt an overwhelming silence swell inside her chest, as if the air itself forbade her to shed a single tear. Her father, Alyamide, was a man respected by all, strong, kind, and a protector of the village's old ways. His sudden death came like a storm in the dry season, unexpected and harsh. At the gathering of mourners, as the chief stepped forward to address the grieving family, his voice cut through the quiet with a firmness that shocked even the boldest among them. "You, Adissa," the chief said, his eyes steady and cold, "will not cry at your father's grave." His words echoed in the hushed crowd, heavy with meaning. "If you do, a curse will befall this village. A curse that no blade can cut, no medicine can heal. Your tears will wake forces that should sleep." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked at Adissa with pity, others with fear. But none dared to question the chief. His word was law and ancient wisdom backed him. Adissa stood still, her heart pounding wildly beneath her ribs, but her face betrayed no emotion. Her lips pressed tight, her eyes fixed on the coffin before her. Around her, the women sobbed, their cries rising like a chorus of pain and hope. Yet she remained silent, a pillar of stillness amid the storm of grief. Then, as the coffin was lowered into the earth, a strange sound rippled through the heavy air. A subtle vibration, like a whisper from beneath the soil. The ground seemed to breathe, the coffin lid trembling ever so slightly, as if something inside struggled to break free. No one else noticed this eerie moment, caught up as they were in their own sorrow, but Adissa felt it deep within her bones. She held her silence as the chief commanded, but the stillness was far from peace. It was the beginning of something old, something powerful stirring awake, and it was only the first breath of a story that would shake the very roots of the village. Adissa's father, Alyamide, was more than just a man to the people of their village. He was a pillar of strength and wisdom, a guardian of traditions and a protector of his people's well-being. His presence was like the mighty baobab tree under which the village often gathered to seek counsel and solace. Alyamide had spent his life weaving himself into the fabric of the community, offering help where it was needed, settling disputes with fairness, and guiding the younger generation toward a future rooted in respect and harmony. His laughter had been a warm melody, his voice a steady rhythm that reassured all who heard it. When he passed, the village felt as if the heart of their world had stopped beating. Yet, there was an unsettling whisper among some elders that his death was not the natural passage of time but the result of darker forces at work. Alyamide had been outspoken in his later years, questioning the authority of certain council members and warning against secrets kept too long beneath the surface of their peaceful village life. The suddenness of his passing, along with the chief's stern command that Adissa not cry, cast a shadow that stretched far beyond mere grief. It felt unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to emerge. In this village, women's cries at funerals were more than expressions of sorrow, they were sacred invocations meant to guide the spirits gently toward the ancestors' realm. The daughters' tears were believed to be a necessary ritual, a release valve for the living's grief and a welcome mat for the departed. Without these cries, it was thought, the spirit might linger in unrest, trapped between worlds, and the delicate balance of the village's spiritual order could be broken. Yet paradoxically, the elders also feared that too much grief, too many tears, could awaken spirits too soon or too violently, tearing open doors that were meant to remain closed until the appointed time. This duality of belief, the need for tears and the fear of their power, was ancient and deeply rooted. It was said that in times past, when women's wails had grown too loud, fierce storms would rage, crops would fail, and misfortune would sweep through the land like a relentless wind. The village learned to walk the fine line between mourning and silence, a balance carefully maintained by strict customs. For Adissa, however, the chief's decree meant she was to carry the heaviest burden of all. To grieve without tears, to honor her father's memory without the sacred release that had comforted generations before her. Inside Adissa the silence was a living thing. Her eyes, steady and unyielding like stones, betrayed no sign of the tempest within. Yet beneath that calm surface, her soul flooded with sorrow deeper than any river, heavier than the darkest night. Every heartbeat felt like a drum of pain, every breath a reminder of what she had lost. Her body stood still, but her spirit writhed in a silent scream that no one could hear. She found herself walking through the village in the days after the funeral, a ghost among the living. The once familiar paths seemed foreign, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath her feet. In the marketplace, voices hushed when she passed. In the fields, workers glanced her way with a mixture of pity and fear. Even the children, who had once run to greet her with laughter, now avoided her gaze. She was no longer just Adissa, the daughter of Alyamide. She was the girl who did not cry, the living silence that unsettled the village's heart. At night, the quiet became almost unbearable. The walls of her small hut seemed to close in, and the darkness whispered secrets she was not sure she wanted to know. Sometimes she would press her hands against the earth beneath her feet, feeling the cold pulse of the soil as if it beat like a hidden heart. It was during these moments that a creeping sensation began to take hold, an unease that something was stirring beneath the ground where her father now rested. This feeling was not like grief or fear, it was something older, more primal. The air around the graveyard seemed thick with whispers carried on the wind, voices too faint to understand but persistent enough to gnaw at her mind. She could almost hear the rustling of leaves turning in a language lost to time, a calling from the depths where the roots of the ancestors tangled with the secrets of the earth. Despite her resolve to stay silent, Adissa felt drawn toward the graveyard each night. The other villagers avoided it after dusk, respecting the ancient belief that the spirits were most restless under the moon's gaze. But she could not stay away. Each visit was a silent vigil, a search for meaning in the shadows. Her heart yearned for answers, answers to why her father's death felt unnatural, why the chief had forbidden her tears, and why the earth beneath the coffin seemed restless. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled shades of purple and red, Adissa stood at the edge of the graveyard. The cool breeze carried with it the scent of damp soil and wilted flowers, and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. She knelt beside the freshly turned earth, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the grave. The ground was cold and firm, but beneath her fingertips she felt a faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat. Her breath caught, and she withdrew her hand slowly, unsure if what she had felt was real or a trick of her aching mind. In the silence, the village seemed to hold its breath alongside her. Somewhere far away, a lone owl hooted, its call echoing like a mournful song. Adissa closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wished with all her heart to cry, to let the torrent of sorrow spill out as it had done for her ancestors, but the chief's words rang in her ears like a curse. She forced herself to be still, to hold the grief inside like a burning ember. And yet, with each passing day, the weight of the forbidden grief grew heavier. Her silence became a shield, but also a prison. She felt caught between worlds, between the living and the dead, between the traditions that bound her and the sorrow that threatened to break her. Beneath the soil, something stirred, as if her father's spirit reached out from the darkness, waiting for her to listen, waiting for the silence to be broken in a way the village had never imagined. Adissa's story was no longer just about loss. It was about the power of silence, the danger of buried secrets, and the strength it takes to face a grief that defies the rules. The village held its breath, unaware that the quiet girl who would not cry was on the brink of awakening a force that could change everything forever. At first, the sounds were so faint that Adissa questioned whether they were real or just echoes of her restless mind. In the deep silence of the night, when the village had long settled into sleep, she would hear whispers, soft, barely audible murmurs that seemed to float on the cool breeze that crept through the cracks in her hut. The whispers were not words she could understand, but they carried a tone both urgent and mournful, like a secret trying desperately to be heard. Sometimes, the faint scratching of something moving beneath the earth would accompany the whispers, a subtle rhythm that sent shivers along her spine. At first, she kept these experiences to herself, fearing the villagers' judgment. But as the nights passed, the sounds grew more persistent, more insistent. It was as if the very ground beneath her was alive, speaking in a language older than time. One night, as she lay awake beneath the woven mat that was her bed, the wind seemed to carry her name, Adissa, softly, almost tenderly, yet laden with sorrow. When she finally confided in her closest friend, Amara, the response was not comforting. Amara's eyes were filled with pity, and she shook her head slowly. "You're letting the grief consume you, Adissa," she said gently. "The village has lost many before, and none heard voices from the earth. You must rest your mind." Other villagers echoed similar sentiments when she mentioned the sounds. "It is the weight of sorrow making you see and hear what is not there," they said. "You must let go or the spirits will take you too." But Adissa knew the difference between grief and reality. These were not hallucinations born from sadness. These were calls, messages from somewhere beneath the surface, trying to break through the veil of silence that had been forced upon her. Each night, she would press her ear to the ground outside her hut, straining to catch the elusive whispers. The more she listened, the more she felt connected to something vast and ancient. Her dreams became battlegrounds of sorrow and mystery. Each night, she was pulled into a vision of her father standing waist-deep in dark, still water. His eyes searched hers, filled with a desperate longing to speak, but his mouth was bound tight by thick, twisting roots that grew from the earth itself. No matter how much he tried to cry out, the roots strangled his voice, leaving only a silent plea that echoed in the depths of her soul. In these dreams, the water was cold and heavy, pressing down on her chest as if trying to pull her under. She could see the surface shimmering above him, blurred and distant, like a fragile barrier between worlds. Alyamide's figure was powerful and regal, but trapped. A prisoner caught between life and death, caught in the tangled grip of the earth's hidden forces. Sometimes she would reach out to free him, but her hands passed through the roots as if they were smoke. Each awakening left her breathless, haunted by the image of her father's silent struggle. The dreams were so vivid that she could feel the cold water chilling her skin, the weight of the roots tightening around her heart. She longed to shout, to weep, to break the silence that held her captive, but the chief's curse echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. The villagers' dismissals and warnings only deepened Adissa's isolation. They saw her growing pale, her once steady eyes flickering with a flicker of desperation. Her silence, once admired for its strength, now seemed to them a sign of a mind unraveling. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering cautionary tales of madness born from forbidden grief. But for Adissa, the whispers beneath the earth were not madness. They were a call to awaken something hidden, a warning that the delicate balance her village relied on was shifting. With each passing night, the voices grew stronger, the scratching louder, the wind more insistent. They were reaching for her, pulling her toward a destiny entwined with the mysteries buried deep beneath the soil. And so, even as the village turned away, afraid of what her silence might mean, Adissa clung to the whispers and the dreams. She knew that somewhere in the shadows beneath the earth, her father's spirit was trapped, waiting for her to break the silence, not with tears but with the courage to listen and act when the time came. As days bled into nights, Adissa found herself drawn more and more to the remnants of her father's life, the worn belongings tucked away in their small hut, the faded clothes hanging silently on hooks, and especially the old drum that had once echoed through village celebrations. The drum was more than an instrument, it was a symbol of her father's voice, a heartbeat that had united the people in times of joy and strength. Now it sat quiet, heavy with memories and secrets. One afternoon, as the sun filtered weakly through the dusty window, Adissa's fingers brushed against the drum's hollow inside. She was searching for something, anything that might explain the unrest gnawing at her soul, when her hand found a small folded piece of parchment carefully tucked beneath the drum's skin. Her breath caught as she gently pulled it free, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The edges were worn, the ink faded but still legible, and her heart pounded as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, firm, deliberate strokes that carried the weight of a man burdened with both hope and fear. The letter began with a greeting meant only for her, revealing a side of Alyamide that few in the village had ever seen, a man fighting a silent battle beneath the surface of their peaceful lives. "My dearest Adissa," it read, "if you are reading this, it means that I am no longer by your side, and that the shadows have crept closer than I had hoped. There are those in the council who serve not the people, but their own greed and thirst for power. I have stood against them in silence, working quietly to protect our village from corruption that threatens to destroy all we hold dear." Her fingers trembled as she read on, the words unfolding a hidden history of resistance and courage. Her father's death was not a mere passing of time or a random fate, but the result of a conspiracy to silence his voice forever. The letter warned of the dangers lurking within the very council that governed their lives, hinting at betrayal by those who should have been guardians of their traditions and welfare. But the most startling revelation came next, the reason behind the chief's order that Edissa was forbidden to cry. Her father explained that her silence was not just in obedience to ancient customs, it was a deliberate act of power, a shield against the dark forces that sought to manipulate grief for their own ends. "You are not to cry, my daughter," the letter cautioned. "Your silence holds a power they fear, a strength that can protect or destroy. Tears would awaken forces that are not yet ready to be faced, forces that would tear apart the balance of our world. Hold your grief inside, and it will become a weapon against those who wish to harm you and our people." Edissa's mind reeled with the weight of this secret. The grief she had struggled to contain was no longer just sorrow, it was a form of resistance, a sacred strength passed down through blood and spirit. Her silence was a deliberate act of defiance, a line drawn in the sand against those who would abuse their power. The letter also contained a plea, a request for her to trust in herself, to listen to the whispers beneath the earth, and to prepare for a time when the truth would be revealed and justice restored. Her father's words were both a comfort and a call to action, a reminder that even in death he was with her, guiding her through the darkness. As she folded the letter carefully and tucked it close to her heart, Edissa felt a shift within her. The silence that had once been a heavy burden now seemed like a mantle she was meant to wear, a source of strength that connected her to her father's legacy and the hidden battles fought in the shadows. Outside, the village continued its cautious rhythms, unaware of the storm gathering beneath the surface. The council members smiled and nodded in public, but in private, fear crept into their eyes. They knew that Edissa's silence was not submission, it was a force they could not control. And so, with the secret of her father's rebellion burning in her soul, Edissa stood at the crossroads of grief and power, silence and defiance. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but she no longer felt alone. Her father's spirit, entwined with the whispers beneath the earth and the strength of her own silent resolve, was a beacon in the darkness. The time was coming when the village's carefully constructed facade would crumble, and Edissa's silence would be the key to unlocking the truth, and shaking the very foundations of the world she had always known. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as Edissa sat quietly outside her hut. The village had fallen into its usual evening lull, children's laughter fading, fires dying down, and the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. But tonight, a different presence stirred the stillness, one that sent a ripple of anticipation through her chest. A sleek black crow appeared suddenly, perching on the low branch of a nearby tree. Its feathers gleamed with an almost unnatural sheen, catching the fading light like shards of night. Edissa's breath caught. She knew this bird. It had been her father's familiar, a symbol of his wisdom and a companion during long, silent vigils. The crow had vanished for months after her father's death, and yet here it was as if summoned by the deep pull of her grief and growing resolve. The crow tilted its head, regarding her with sharp, intelligent eyes. Then, in a voice that was at once eerie and clear, it spoke a single word: "Listen." Edissa's heart raced. No one else in the village had ever heard a crow speak, at least not aloud. This was a message meant only for her. She nodded, a silent promise passing between them, and stood. The crow took flight, its wings slicing through the air with effortless grace, leading her away from the safety of her home and into the dense thicket bordering the village. Night after night, Edissa followed the crow's call. It led her through twisting paths lit by the moon's silver glow, deeper into the wilderness than she had ever dared to venture. The village felt like a distant memory behind her, and the air grew heavy with the scent of earth and ancient trees. On the seventh night, the crow finally stopped at the base of an enormous tree whose gnarled roots dug deep into the soil like the fingers of some ancient giant. The ground beneath it seemed to pulse with a strange, rhythmic energy, an almost imperceptible vibration that thrummed against Edissa's feet. It was as if the very heart of the earth beat here, where the tree stood sentinel. The crow cawed softly, hopping from one root to another, then turned its gaze toward Edissa, repeating, "Listen." She closed her eyes and leaned forward, pressing her palm against the rough bark. The whispers she had heard before grew louder now, no longer faint but urgent, weaving through the air like a secret chorus. She felt the hum of life beneath her fingertips, the roots' subtle movements, the soil's breath, and something else, something deeper and darker. In her mind's eye, the image of her father's figure standing in the water returned. But this time he was not alone. Shadows flickered behind him, figures bound by silence and secrecy, trapped between worlds by unseen forces. The roots that gagged him in her dreams now stretched into reality, twisting through the earth like chains holding not just her father, but others who had fallen victim to the council's greed. Odysseus' breath hitched. The village's calm was a lie, a fragile veneer over a hidden prison beneath the soil. The whispers weren't just voices, they were cries for justice, for release. And she was the key. That night, as she returned home under the watchful eyes of the stars, the crow followed close by, its sharp gaze never leaving her. The message was clear. Odysseus was no longer a silent observer of grief. She was being called to awaken the power within her silence, to listen not just with her ears, but with her spirit. The crow's presence gave her courage, a silent companion in the lonely nights ahead. And though the village slept unaware, Odysseus felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. Her father's death was only the beginning, and the path to truth would be long and perilous. But for the first time since the funeral, Odysseus allowed herself to hope. The silence she bore was no longer a cage, it was a calling. And the crow's word echoed in her mind, listen. Odysseus' resolve had hardened like forged steel. Each night spent in the company of the talking crow, each whispered secret from the earth beneath the old tree, had carved a fire inside her, a fire demanding truth and justice. The weight of her father's letter, the murmurs beneath the soil, and the shadowed history the elders guarded in silence pressed on her heart, urging her forward. It was time. She could no longer bear the suffocating quiet of unanswered questions. With the first light of dawn bleeding through the thatched roofs of the village, Odysseus stood before the worn steps of the council house, a simple structure of timber and mud, but one that held the power of generations. Inside, the elders gathered, faces etched with lines of age and authority, draped in robes that spoke of their status and the heavy burden of tradition. The air was thick with incense and murmurs of prayer, as if the very walls sought to guard the secrets within. Odysseus' footsteps echoed through the entrance as she entered, her figure small but unwavering against the imposing assembly. The murmurs ceased. Eyes sharp as hawks turned to her. The silence that followed was deafening. I demand answers, she said, voice steady, carrying the weight of all the years of silence she had borne. Why was I forbidden to cry at my father's grave? What truth do you hide behind this curse? Why was my father's death shrouded in secrecy? Her words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the council. Some elders shifted uneasily, others exchanged glances heavy with caution. Then Elder Ajaka, the oldest and most revered among them, stepped forward. His eyes, though clouded with age, burned with a fierce light. You speak with boldness, child, Ajaka said, voice grave and measured. But there are things that must remain hidden, truths too dangerous for the hearts of the young. Odysseus did not flinch. I am no longer a child. The village deserves the truth. My father was a man of honor. Why was his death made a silent affair? Why must my grief be shackled by fear? A murmur rippled through the elders. Ajaka raised his hand, silencing them. Long ago, he began, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the room, our village faced a great peril. A darkness that threatened to consume our lands and our people. It was a time when the spirits of the ancestors walked close to the living, and the boundaries between worlds were thin and fragile. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. In those desperate days, the founding elders forged a pact with the unseen forces, a covenant sealed with silence. It was agreed that the daughters of the village would not weep openly at the graves of their fathers. Their silence would act as a shield, a barrier to the restless spirits who might otherwise be unleashed prematurely. Odysseus' heart pounded. A pact? Why was I never told? Why was my father's death marked by such fear? Ajaka's eyes darkened with sorrow. Because that silence is not merely tradition, it is protection. Tears, as sacred as they are, hold a power that can open doors best left closed. The council fears that if you break this silence, if your cries echo at your father's grave, it could shatter the delicate balance. The spirits might rise too soon, and the curse would fall not only on you, but on all who live here. A cold chill ran through Odysseus' veins. The curse was real then, not just a superstition whispered among the villagers. But her spirit burned brighter. Is this why my father was silenced? Because he threatened this fragile peace. Ajaka nodded slowly. Alyamide was a man of courage and conviction. His rebellion stirred unrest, and some feared his voice would bring ruin. His death was a sacrifice to maintain order, an act to preserve the pact. The room fell into heavy silence, the elders' faces etched with the burden of centuries-old secrets. Odysseus felt a swell of anger and sorrow but also clarity. The silence forced upon her was not just a punishment, it was a weapon wielded by those in power to keep the village in submission. She took a step forward, eyes blazing. Then I refuse to be silent any longer. If my father's death was a lie wrapped in silence, then I will break that silence. I will cry at his grave and I will face whatever comes. Ajaka's gaze sharpened. Beware, Adissa. You tread on a path fraught with peril. The silence is a pact with powers beyond your understanding. Breaking it could unravel the very fabric of our existence. Adissa met his warning with unwavering resolve. If silence is the price of peace, then it is a peace bought with chains. I will not live in fear of tears, nor watch the truth buried beneath the earth. The elders exchanged glances once more, some with resignation, others with concern. Ajaka stepped back, his voice softer but no less grave. You carry a heavy burden, child. But remember, strength lies not only in defiance, but in understanding the roots from which we come. As she left the council house, Adissa's mind swirled with the weight of ancient pacts and the looming threat of a curse. The village's prosperity, the fragile peace maintained by generations of silence, it all rested on a delicate balance that her father's death had upset. Yet, within her, the silence she bore was no longer a shackle but a shield. The truth had been whispered by the earth, sealed in her father's letter, and confirmed by the elders' own words. Her tears were forbidden not merely to suppress grief but to guard against a power that could unmake the world. With the crow's command echoing in her heart, listen, Adissa prepared to confront the darkness lurking beneath the village, ready to shake the foundations of everything she had known. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but her silence was no longer weakness. It was the first step toward awakening a power long dormant, a power that would challenge the ancient pact and bring light to the shadowed corners of her world. Under the cloak of midnight, when the village lay swallowed in darkness and silence, Adissa made her way back to the place where it all began, the grave of her father. The moon hung low and pale, casting a silver glow over the earth, the tombstone standing stark and solemn against the night sky. Each step she took was measured, her breath steady but her heart pounding with a tempest of emotions, fear, determination, sorrow, and hope. The villagers had warned her of the consequences. The elders had made clear the ancient pact that forbade any daughter from crying at a father's grave. Yet, despite the weight of their threats and the knowledge of the curse that might be unleashed, Adissa was resolved. This night, she would confront the silence that had bound her since childhood. Reaching the grave, she knelt down, her hands brushing aside the loose soil that had been freshly turned in mourning. The earth felt cool and heavy beneath her fingers, a tangible barrier between the world of the living and the mysteries buried beneath. She pressed her ear gently to the soil, and the silence that greeted her was profound, until, faint but unmistakable, a voice whispered her name. Adissa. Her breath hitched. The sound was both haunting and familiar, like the echo of a long-forgotten memory. It stirred something deep inside her, a connection to the man whose life had been stolen, whose death had been shrouded in secrecy and fear. Yet, true to the vow she had made to herself, Adissa did not cry. Not a single tear fell. Instead, she began to hum softly, a melody that had been passed down to her by her father in days when laughter and light still filled their home. The song was ancient, a lullaby woven with the rhythms of their land, a thread of life and memory binding the past to the present. As her voice mingled with the night air, the wind shifted. It was subtle at first, a gentle breeze swirling through the trees, but soon grew stronger, circling around her like a living force. The air thickened, charged with an energy that sent shivers down her spine. Beneath her, the soil trembled faintly, a soft cracking sound rising from the earth itself. The ground around the grave shifted, small fissures appearing like veins in the dark soil. Her heart pounded in response, a drumbeat syncing with the rhythm of the earth's secret awakening. Suddenly, the coffin lid quivered beneath the cracked earth, the edges pressing upward as if pushed by an unseen hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement, ominous and yet filled with a strange promise. Adissa's eyes widened, but she held her ground. Her silence was not one of submission but of strength. The song on her lips wove through the night, a call to her father and to the spirits bound by the ancient pact. The wind carried her melody far beyond the graveyard, stirring the leaves and whispering through the village like a summons. Somewhere in the darkness, the talking crow took flight, its wings beating a rhythm that matched her heart. As the soil cracked and the coffin lid shifted, Adissa understood that breaking the pact was not merely an act of rebellion, it was an awakening. The silence that had held her captive was beginning to fracture, and with it, the hidden truths buried beneath generations of fear. The night air buzzed with possibility and danger, and as she rose from the earth, her eyes no longer held the weight of sorrow but the fierce light of someone ready to challenge fate itself. Her journey was far from over, but with each note she hummed, the power of her silence grew, a power that would shake the very roots of the village and unlock the secrets kept by the dead. Generations before Odissa was born, long before the village ever knew her name, a dark chapter had been written in the annals of the land, one so terrifying that it became a tale whispered only in hushed tones around fires, a story cloaked in shadows and silence. This was the origin of the curse that had bound the daughters of the village for centuries, a curse that explained the harsh rule forbidding tears at the graves of fathers. The village elders, wise and wary, had once faced an ancient evil, a dark spirit born from sorrow itself, a malevolent force that fed on the tears and grief of the living. It was a spirit that thrived on the anguish of women mourning their lost loved ones, growing stronger with each cry, each wail echoing through the night. As the legend went, this spirit was not merely a ghost but a manifestation of sorrow so powerful it could tear the veil between the worlds and bring devastation upon the land. The story told of the first daughter who dared to break the silence, a young woman named Amara. Her father had been taken by a sudden illness, and in her grief, Amara had wept openly at his burial. Her tears fell like rain, streaming down her face as she mourned freely and loudly, defying the warnings of the village elders. For a time, her sorrow seemed natural and innocent, but soon after, the skies darkened with heavy clouds, and a flood unlike any before swept through the valley. Homes were lost, crops ruined, and the village was nearly wiped out. The floodwaters were said to be the spirit's wrath, unleashed by the breaking of the sacred silence. The villagers were terrified. They believed that Amara's cries had broken the delicate seal holding the spirit at bay, allowing it to rise with fury. The elders convened, desperate to find a way to protect their people from further disaster. They decreed that from that day forward, daughters were forbidden to cry openly at the graves of their fathers or any loved ones. The silence of the women became a shield, a sacred pact meant to keep the spirit imprisoned beneath the earth. But the curse was cruel and relentless. The tale did not end with Amara's flood. The second daughter who broke the silence was said to have caused a famine, the crops withering and the animals dying mysteriously. Her tears were blamed for the failure of the harvest, believed to have angered the spirit anew. From then on, the silence was enforced not only by fear but by tradition and the weight of generations of loss. Odissa, listening to this ancient lore, felt the heavy chain of history coil tighter around her. Her silence was no mere obedience to superstition, it was a powerful barrier that kept the village safe from a darkness that lurked just beyond sight. Her silence was paradoxically a source of strength. She learned that the power of silence echoed through the land like a song, a protective force that resonated with the very spirit world. Her father's rebellion, his sudden death, and the council's attempts to keep her silent all tied into this delicate balance. Her tears, forbidden as they were, could shatter the fragile peace and release the ancient spirit once more. But there was a revelation deeper still. The silence was not only a shield but a key. It held the power to contain or unleash the spirit depending on the will behind it. Odyssa's own silence, her refusal to cry despite the crushing weight of grief, was not submission, it was a deliberate act of power. Her hums, the song her father taught her, were threads weaving through the curse, holding the spirit at bay with an ancient melody that spoke of life, hope, and endurance. The crow's return, the whispers beneath the earth, the shifting coffin lid, they were all signs that the spirit was restless, sensing a change in the balance. Odyssa's silence was becoming a force that challenged the old ways, threatening to unravel the pact or transform it into something new. As she pieced together the history, Odissa understood the enormity of her burden. To break the curse could mean disaster or salvation. To cry could unleash the spirit's wrath. To remain silent meant carrying the pain alone, a prisoner to a tradition that demanded sacrifice without explanation. The knowledge settled heavy on her heart but also lit a fire of purpose. She was no longer a silent girl bound by fear. She was the living echo of generations, the guardian of a fragile peace, and perhaps the one who could finally face the spirit and end the cycle of sorrow. With this understanding, Odissa resolved to learn more about the spirit itself, to seek out the source of its sorrow, to confront the darkness with the light of truth and courage. The curse of the silent wives was not just a chain to hold her back but a call to arms, a challenge to awaken the power within her and the village. The night outside was still, but the air thrummed with the promise of change. Odyssa's silence, once a shackle, was now the foundation of a strength that would either save or shatter everything she held dear. The The night was dense and thick with anticipation as Edissa approached her father's grave once more, carrying in her hands the ancient drum she had discovered tucked away within his belongings. This drum was no ordinary instrument, it was a vessel of history and power, its surface worn smooth by years of use, its skin stretched taut like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Within its hollow body she had found the secret letter, his whispered confession of rebellion and warning. Now it was time to awaken its true purpose. Setting the drum carefully beside the grave, Edissa positioned herself to begin. The village was silent, cloaked in darkness, yet beneath the stillness, a palpable energy hummed in the air. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her ancestors and the unspoken burdens of the village pressing down upon her. Then, with a firm yet reverent hand, she began to beat the drum. The sound that emerged was unlike anything the village had heard before. It was deep and rhythmic, a pulse that echoed through the soil and sky like the beating of a mighty heart. Each strike was deliberate, resonating with the memory of her father's spirit and the rhythm of life itself. The drumbeat seemed to awaken something long dormant beneath the earth, sending ripples through the ground as if the very bones of the land were stirring in response. As the first beats echoed, the villagers stirred in their homes, eyes fluttering open as a subtle tremor rolled through the village. The earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse, gentle at first, then growing stronger like the rising tide of a distant storm. Doors rattled on their hinges, and the branches of the ancient trees groaned as if awakening from a long slumber. From the shadows of the trees, from the murmur of the rivers, and even from the quiet rooftops, faint whispers began to rise, delicate and haunting. Edissa, they called, voices carried on the wind, soft as a lover's breath yet charged with power. The name floated through the air, weaving through the village like an invisible thread, binding the living with the spirits beyond. Edissa's heart raced in response to the voices, but she held her ground, her hands steady on the drum. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving into the drum's pulse like a chorus of unseen voices singing an ancient song. The spirits were answering her call, their presence felt like a shiver running down her spine, a breath on the back of her neck. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm guide her. Each beat was a bridge between worlds, a language older than words, speaking to the ancestors who had long guarded the village and to the dark spirit lurking beneath the soil. The drum spoke of life and death, sorrow and hope, and the delicate balance that held them all in place. The village elders, awakened by the tremors, gathered hurriedly, their faces pale with fear and confusion. They recognized the drumbeat instantly, it was the call of the dead, a summons that could bring both salvation and destruction. They whispered among themselves, debating whether to intervene or let the ancient power run its course. Meanwhile, the whispers continued to grow, swirling around Edissa like a tempest of voices. They spoke in riddles and memories, revealing fragments of the past, her father's courage, the betrayal of the council, and the sorrow that had fed the dark spirit for generations. The spirits urged her to listen, to understand, and to find the strength to break the cycle. As the drumbeat rose to a crescendo, the ground beneath the grave cracked open slightly, revealing faint glimmers of light seeping from the earth. The coffin lid, once firmly sealed, began to tremble and shift once more, as if responding to the ancient call. Edissa's silence, her refusal to cry, and now her drumming had woven together a powerful spell, a heartbeat that resonated with the life force of the village and the restless souls beneath. She was no longer just a silent girl, she was the drumbeat of the dead, the living voice of the ancestors and the harbinger of change. The night stretched on, filled with the rhythm of the drum and the whispers of the spirits. Edissa felt the weight of history upon her but also the surge of newfound power. The village's fate hung in the balance, poised on the edge of an ancient secret ready to be unveiled. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the tremors slowly ceased, the whispers faded, and the earth settled once more. But the village knew, and Edissa knew too, nothing would ever be the same again. The drumbeat had awakened the past, and with it, the promise of a future rewritten by courage, silence, and the unbreakable bond between the living and the dead. The seventh night arrived heavy and foreboding, as if the very sky mourned alongside Edissa. Thick storm clouds gathered overhead, swirling and darkening the moon's glow, casting a restless shadow over the village. The wind howled like a restless spirit, carrying with it the whispers of the past and the promise of something beyond the ordinary. Edissa felt the weight of the moment press down on her chest as she made her way through the trembling village toward her father's grave. Her feet moved with purpose and resolve, each step steady despite the growing tempest around her. The villagers watched in silence from their doorways, some with fear, others with hope, all aware that something momentous was unfolding. The air crackled with tension as the night grew colder, and the first distant rumbles of thunder echoed in the distance. When Odissa reached the grave, she paused for a moment, letting the swirling storm surround her. The earth beneath her seemed alive, humming softly, pulsing with the lingering heartbeat of the drum she had played over the past nights. The soil was dark and moist, freshly turned from the earlier tremors and cracks that had unsettled the ground. This was the place where the boundary between the living and the dead thinned, where secrets buried for generations whispered beneath the surface. With trembling hands, Odissa retrieved the drum, the very instrument that had become her connection to the unseen forces, feeling its familiar weight and the rhythm still echoing in her veins. She raised it once more, ready for the final heartbeat, the last call to the ancestors and the restless spirit that bound her fate to the village. Her hands struck the drum gently at first, the sound soft but sure, a heartbeat that matched the storm's steady growl. Each beat reverberated through the air, mingling with the rush of the wind and the distant roll of thunder. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, a call to awaken what was hidden, a summons that could not be ignored. She stared intently at the soil before her, eyes wide and unblinking, waiting for a sign, a response to the drum's final message. The night seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The ground lay still, silent, as if listening but not yet ready to reveal its secret. Then, without warning, a creaking sound pierced the silence, a groan of ancient wood shifting against time itself. Odissa's heart skipped a beat. The coffin lid, buried beneath the earth, began to move. Slowly, painfully, it creaked open, disturbing the soil and revealing what should have been the resting place of her father's body. But there was no body inside. Instead, where she expected to see flesh and bone, she found a mirror, an ornate, ancient mirror, its frame carved with symbols of the ancestors and the village's forgotten history. The glass shimmered faintly in the storm's flickering light, reflecting the dark sky and the fierce determination in Odissa's own eyes. A shiver ran down her spine as she leaned closer, compelled to look into the mirror's depths. What stared back was not just her own reflection but a shifting tapestry of visions. Images of the past and future, the living and the dead intertwined in an endless dance. She saw her father's face not as the man who had died, but as a younger warrior, fierce and unyielding, standing tall against unseen enemies. She saw the village, caught between prosperity and ruin, its fate hanging on the edge of a fragile balance. But most unsettling was the presence lurking behind her reflection, a shadowy figure barely visible, yet unmistakably there. It was the dark spirit, the ancient force fed by sorrow and silence, watching and waiting. Its eyes gleamed with hunger, and yet there was something almost pleading in its gaze, as if bound by a sorrow deeper than pain. Odissa reached out tentatively, fingertips grazing the mirror's surface. The glass rippled beneath her touch as if alive, responding to her presence. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing down like tears from the heavens, thunder crashing in a wild symphony that echoed the turmoil within her. The mirror began to pulse with light, and the visions grew sharper. She saw the faces of the silent wives who had come before her, their tears locked away behind the mirror's surface, their grief trapped in a prison of reflection. She saw the consequences of breaking the silence, the floods, the famine, the curse that had shaped the village's fate. And then a new image emerged, herself standing not as a silent girl but as a leader, breaking the curse by facing the spirit, by confronting the pain that had been buried for too long. The mirror seemed to offer a choice: continue the silence and keep the spirit bound but trapped in sorrow, or break the silence and risk unleashing both destruction and the possibility of healing. The storm's fury reached its peak as Odissa lowered her hand, breath coming in ragged gasps. The mirror's surface shimmered one last time before fading into stillness, reflecting only the darkened sky and the storm's wild dance. Odissa stood alone at the grave, the coffin lid now fully open, the earth beneath trembling faintly. The drumbeat had ceased, but its echo lingered in her heart, a reminder that the past and future were intertwined, that the silent pact was no longer absolute. The village held its breath, caught between fear and hope, as Odissa faced the unknown. She was no longer just a girl bound by silence. She was the bearer of a legacy that demanded courage, a future shaped by the choices she would make. As the first rays of dawn pierced the storm clouds, illuminating the grave and the open coffin, Odissa knew that her journey was far from over. The mirror was a gateway, a reflection of truth and power that could either shatter the curse or unleash the darkness hidden beneath. With the storm fading into a gentle rain, she wrapped the drum close, ready to face whatever awaited. The coffin had opened, but the story was just beginning. Odissa's gaze remained locked on the mirror resting inside the open coffin, her breath shallow as images began to swirl beneath the reflective surface. The glass no longer showed merely her reflection, it opened a portal into the deepest secrets of her bloodline, the hidden history that had shaped her fate and the fate of the village. The first vision was sharp and clear, her father, tall and proud, standing before the village council in a heated argument. Their faces were stern, unmoved by his pleas. Then the scene shifted swiftly, her father clutching his chest, staggering, his eyes wide with betrayal as a shadowy figure slipped a vial of poison into his drink. The council members exchanged cold looks, the poison a silent sentence for defiance. She saw the moment her father's strong hands trembled and fell still, the life draining from him not by accident but by design. The mirror revealed the truth no one in the village dared speak aloud, that her father's death was orchestrated to silence his voice and crush the rebellion he had sparked against the corrupt leaders. They feared his influence, his courage, and the power his bloodline carried. It was a carefully concealed conspiracy that had shaped generations of sorrow and silence. As the visions continued, Adissa watched her ancestors appear, women who had once cried openly at their loved ones' graves, only to be punished for breaking the sacred silence. Their tears were stolen by the winds, their voices swallowed by the earth. They were transformed into wind-bound spirits, forever wandering the edges of the village, unable to find rest or peace. The spirits drifted through the trees and rivers, their whispers barely audible but filled with sorrow and longing. Their punishment was harsh but necessary, the village elders had once claimed, to keep the dark spirit at bay. Adissa's heart ached as she saw these women, their faces pale and eyes hollow, bound by an ancient curse that fed on sorrow and fear. Yet even in their silence there was defiance, an unspoken resistance etched into their very souls. They were trapped between worlds, caught in the eternal struggle between silence and voice. Then the mirror shifted again, revealing the most startling vision of all, herself. But this Adissa was different from the quiet girl the village had known. She stood tall, eyes fierce, not bowed by sorrow but burning with determination. The vision showed her as the one destined to break the curse, not by yielding to silence, but by embracing it as an act of defiance. Her silence was not submission. It was power. A weapon forged in the shadows of betrayal and grief. By refusing to cry, by holding her sorrow within, she was denying the dark spirit the fuel it craved. Her silence was a shield that protected the village from destruction, a secret pact passed down through generations. It was her birthright and burden. The ancestors' spirits watched her, their eyes filled with hope and gratitude. They had waited centuries for someone like Adissa, a daughter who understood that silence was not weakness but strength, who could wield it to confront the darkness lurking beneath the soil. The mirror's surface rippled as if breathing, and the visions faded, leaving Adissa staring at her own reflection once more. She realized that her journey was far from over. To break the curse, she would have to balance the silence and the voice, the sorrow and the strength. Her choices would shape not only her fate but the future of the entire village. The storm outside softened to a gentle rain, washing away the fear and uncertainty. Adissa gathered the drum and the mirror, feeling their weight not as a burden but as a legacy. She was ready to face the truth and the power within her bloodline, to challenge the ancient pact and rewrite the story that had silenced her family for generations. Her silence had shaken the coffin lid, now her voice would echo beyond the grave. As dawn crept over the horizon, spilling soft light across the rain-slick earth, Adissa returned to her father's grave one final time. The village lay hushed beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with expectation. She stood at the edge of the freshly opened earth, the mirror safely tucked away, the drum silent. For years she had held her sorrow inside, clenching her grief like a hidden flame. But now, with the village watching and the spirits waiting, she allowed herself to speak, just one cry, a single sound that broke through centuries of silence. But this cry was not a sob of pain or a wail of despair. It was clear, steady, and powerful, a name, the true name of the dark spirit that had haunted her family's bloodline for generations. It was a name spoken with reverence and courage, a name that held the power to call forth and calm, to confront and command. As her voice echoed across the village, the sky itself seemed to respond. Clouds cracked open with a thunderous roar, and rain fell upward in shimmering droplets, as if the heavens themselves were breaking free from their chains. The wind carried the cry, weaving through the trees and rivers, freeing the ancestors from their long silence. The ancient spirits stirred, their whispers growing louder, transforming into songs that filled the air with warmth and light. The village awakened to a peace they had never known, a calm that came from truth and healing rather than fear and repression. The coffin at her father's grave, once a symbol of death and silence, began to dissolve into mist and light. The soil settled gently, and the storm gave way to a golden sunrise that bathed the village in hope. A final, soft whisper brushed against Odysseus' ear, a voice both familiar and eternal. "Thank you, my daughter." From that day forward, the village embraced a new tradition. Daughters no longer bound by silence but called to sing at burials, their voices a bridge between worlds. Their songs carried the power to honor the dead, heal the living and keep darkness at bay. Odysseus' single cry had shattered the sky, broken the curse, and awakened a future where grief was no longer feared but embraced as a sacred, healing force. The silent girl had become the voice of her people, a beacon of strength and change that would echo through generations to come.